breaking news from Buckingham Palace, which has announced that the King has been diagnosed with cancer. During the King's recent hospital procedure for benign prostate enlargement, a separate issue of concern was noted.
Royal life is built on duty, age, and long promises made to the public. Lately, many have sensed that something heavy has been happening behind palace walls. At 77, King Charles appears to be facing a moment few expected so soon. People everywhere are asking what finally pushed him to this point and why now. Whispers of health, pressure, and responsibility have only grown louder, making this story impossible to ignore. Is the King truly preparing to step aside forever? Join us as we look closely at why King Charles is abdicating and what goodbye really means for him. Crisis and speculations. It began the way many serious things do, but the implications were anything but small. In February 2024, Buckingham Palace released a statement that instantly shifted the tone of King Charles III's reign. The King, then 75, had been diagnosed with cancer.
Charles III has been diagnosed, they say, with a form of cancer. They don't say which kind of cancer, but just that it is a form of cancer.
It was not prostate cancer, the palace stressed, but an undisclosed form discovered incidentally while he was undergoing treatment for an enlarged prostate. That single clarification, meant to be reassuring, only deepened public curiosity. For a monarch who had waited more than 7 decades to ascend the throne, this was an existential moment for the British monarchy. The palace chose transparency, a deliberate break from older royal instincts of silence and concealment. Officials said the King wanted to avoid rumors and misinformation and to encourage early detection and screening by being open about his condition. Still, the announcement was shocking. Charles had barely been on the throne for a year and a half. The coronation glow had not even fully faded, and already the conversation was shifting from beginnings to endings, from plans to contingencies. Across Britain and the Commonwealth, the unspoken question surfaced almost immediately. How long could he realistically continue? Behind the scenes, the King began a demanding and carefully managed treatment schedule. Public-facing engagements were reduced on medical advice, while constitutional duties continued largely out of sight. Red boxes were still delivered. Papers were still read and signed. Weekly audiences, when possible, were adjusted rather than abandoned. But many things about the monarchy changed. Fewer walkabouts, shorter appearances, and a noticeable reliance on senior royals to carry the public-facing weight of the institution started becoming obvious. Throughout 2024 and into 2025, palace updates were measured and cautiously optimistic. The language was consistent, words like progressing well, responding positively, and managed. There was no dramatic declaration of remission, but also no suggestion of imminent danger. Charles, true to form, framed his illness as part of duty rather than interruption. In private briefings, aides emphasized that he was still deeply engaged, still opinionated, still very much himself. Yet even those closest to the situation acknowledged the toll. Cancer treatment, even when successful, is not gentle, especially at his age. The most hopeful signal came in December 2025. In a rare personal message, Charles revealed that doctors had cleared him to reduce his treatment schedule in the coming year. He described the news as a personal blessing.
Just the past hour, the King has delivered a personal message about his experience of cancer and says that his cancer treatment can be reduced in the new year.
Words that carried both relief and fatigue. For supporters, it sounded like confirmation that the worst might be behind him. For others, it read differently. Reduced treatment did not necessarily mean cured, and it certainly did not erase the reality that the King was now a 77-year-old man living with a serious illness while occupying one of the most demanding symbolic roles in the world. That reality became harder to ignore when brief hospital stays began to follow the narrative. On more than one occasion, Charles was admitted for observation after experiencing side effects from treatment. The palace was quick to downplay these episodes, emphasizing that they were precautionary and temporary, not emergencies or new diagnoses. Still, each admission triggered a familiar cycle. Engagements were postponed, headlines multiplied, and succession talk came up again and again. Once the health announcements became a regular feature of palace life, the rumor mill did what it always does when uncertainty meets power. Quietly at first, then loudly, speculation began to spread that King Charles might be considering abdication. Online forums, tabloid headlines, and even some mainstream commentators began asking the same question in different ways. If Charles is undergoing long-term cancer treatment, if his public schedule is reduced, and if his heir is already stepping into a more visible leadership role, then what, exactly, is the plan? No announcement ever came from the palace suggesting abdication was on the table, but in the absence of clarity, interpretation rushed in to fill the gap. Much of this speculation focused on Prince William. By 2024 and 2025, the Prince of Wales was no longer just supporting the monarch, he was increasingly acting as the monarchy's public anchor. He represented the crown at major national events, hosted foreign dignitaries, and took on sensitive issues that once would have been reserved for the sovereign himself. To seasoned royal watchers, this looked less like routine delegation and more like preparation. Commentators began using phrases like soft transition and de facto leadership, language that hinted at abdication without explicitly naming it. Buckingham Palace, however, was quick and consistent in pushing back. Senior sources repeatedly stressed that the king had no intention of stepping aside. Palace aides reminded the press that he had waited longer than any monarch in British history to take the throne, and that walking away voluntarily would contradict everything he had stood for. In private briefings, officials described abdication talk as speculative at best and misleading at worst. Royal historians and constitutional experts largely echoed that view. The British monarchy, unlike some of its European counterparts, is built on the idea of lifelong service. Queen Elizabeth II ruled through war, personal loss, and visible physical decline, never once suggesting she might step down. For Charles, whose entire identity has been shaped by preparation for kingship, abdication could unsettle the very institution he spent decades trying to modernize. Still, not all expert voices agree. Some argue that the modern monarchy is already evolving in practice, if not in principle. They point out that Charles can remain king while delegating most day-to-day responsibilities to senior royals, especially William, without triggering a formal constitutional process. Others are more cautious, warning that even rumors of abdication can weaken the monarchy's authority. They argue that once the idea takes hold publicly, it reframes every health update and every absence as evidence of decline. A formal abdication, they warn, could open the door to parliamentary debates, legal challenges across Commonwealth realms, and renewed Republican movements eager to exploit a moment of instability. What might seem like a personal or compassionate choice could turn into an institutional crisis, and it is precisely that tension between compassion and continuity, between human limits and constitutional rigidity, that turns a simple health story into a far more complicated question about law, precedent, and what would actually have to happen if a British king chose to step aside. Keep watching as we take you through them. Constitutional and legal implications. Once abdication is mentioned, even hypothetically, the conversation usually leaves personal health and enters British constitutional law, something far more rigid and unforgiving. Unlike some European monarchies that have modernized their rules, the United Kingdom has no clean contemporary mechanism for a reigning monarch to voluntarily step aside. Any abdication would require a clear legislation, debated and passed by Parliament, and agreed upon by the government of the day. In other words, it would not be a private or even purely royal decision. It would be a national event, legally and politically exposed. History offers only one real precedent, and it is hardly reassuring. In 1936, King Edward VIII abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, and the fallout was immediate and destabilizing. Parliament had to rush through the His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act. The Commonwealth, even then smaller than it is now, had to scramble to align its laws. The abdication permanently changed the royal line, placing George VI on the throne, and eventually Elizabeth II. It also left a lasting scar on how abdication is perceived in Britain, not as an orderly transition, but as a constitutional emergency born of scandal and rupture. That historical memory still hangs over discussions about Charles. Legal scholars often point out that the monarchy survived Edward VIII's abdication, but it did so at the cost of uncertainty, public anxiety, and political distraction at a dangerous moment in European history. No government today is eager to reopen that door unless absolutely forced to. This is why palace insiders bristle at abdication rumors. Once the legal process starts, it cannot easily be controlled or confined to intention. Because of this, attention often turns to regency. Under the Regency Acts, if a monarch is deemed incapable of carrying out their duties due to illness or infirmity, a regent can be appointed to perform those duties in their place. The monarch retains the title and symbolic authority, but executive functions are handled by the regent. In Charles's case, that regent would almost certainly be Prince William. It is a solution that avoids the emotional and constitutional shock of abdication while acknowledging physical reality. Regency has existed in British law for centuries and has been used before, most notably during the mental illness of King George III. What makes it sensitive today is perception. Declaring a regency would require formal medical assessments and legal declarations that publicly define the king as unable to rule. For a monarch who values dignity, continuity, and personal agency, that step carries its own weight. It may preserve the crown, but it also freezes Charles in a symbolic role while power shifts away from him. Behind the constitutional debates is even a much more human reality. King Charles is not just a monarch managing illness and duty. He is also a father managing complicated relationships under the harshest public spotlight imaginable. As his health has become a subject of global attention, the situation in his own family has shaped how people interpret his strength, his authority, and even the future of the crown. The relationship with Prince William sits at the center of this. Over the past few years, William has taken on a visibly larger role. He has represented the monarchy at major national moments, stood in for his father at sensitive engagements, and become the public face many people now associate with leadership and stability. This has sparked a persistent debate about who really runs the monarchy on a day-to-day basis. Officially, Charles remains in charge. Operationally, however, William's presence has grown impossible to ignore. Public perception has played a big role here. William is often seen as more modern, more in tune with the concerns of younger generations, and more emotionally accessible. His approach contrasts with Charles's more formal, sometimes distant style, shaped by decades of waiting and restraint. This comparison is not always fair, but it is constant. Every time William steps forward, intentionally or not, it adds pressure on Charles, reinforcing the idea that a transition is already underway, even if no one has said so out loud. But if William represents continuity, Prince Harry represents unresolved fracture. The breakdown of Charles's relationship with his younger son has played out very publicly, from interviews and documentaries to Harry's memoir. The accusations, the hurt, and the sense of betrayal have all damaged the image of family unity that the monarchy depends on. For a king already dealing with illness, this emotional weight matters. It affects not only private conversations, but public confidence in his ability to hold the family and, by extension, the institution together. There have been signs of possible softening. Harry's continued work with the Invictus Games, an event closely linked to service and veterans, has created moments where reconciliation feels at least imaginable. Reports suggest that Harry has expressed a desire to reconnect, especially given his father's health. Whether those efforts lead anywhere meaningful remains uncertain, but the fact that reconciliation is even discussed shows how closely Charles's personal life is now tied to the monarchy's public narrative. Throughout all of this, Queen Camilla's role has evolved since Charles became king. Once one of the most controversial figures in royal life, she is now widely described as his main source of support. She has taken on additional duties, adjusted her schedule around his treatment, and helped maintain a sense of continuity when Charles steps back. Still, public affection for Camilla is mixed. Many have accepted her. Some never will. And at 78 herself, questions naturally arise about how much more responsibility she can realistically absorb. Charles's wider family also plays a role in the pressure surrounding succession. Princess Anne continues to be one of the hardest-working royals, often stepping in where needed. Prince Edward supports the institution in a lower-profile but reliable way. Keep watching. There's more. Shifting perception. Now, public opinion has become one of the most powerful forces shaping the story around King Charles. Unlike the private struggles inside palace walls, public perception is loud, measurable, and often unforgiving. Polls, media coverage, and online debate have turned the king's personal situation into a wider judgment on whether the monarchy, as it exists today, still fits the country it represents. Approval ratings tell an uncomfortable story. While Charles commands respect for his long service and environmental advocacy, his popularity has consistently trailed behind that of Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales. Among younger people especially, the gap is striking. Many in this generation see William and Kate as relatable, modern, and emotionally in tune with contemporary life. Charles, by contrast, is often viewed as formal, distant, and tied to an older version of royal authority. This perception is not new, but his illness has amplified it, making comparisons unavoidable. For younger audiences, the monarchy itself increasingly feels outdated. The idea of inherited power sits uneasily alongside modern values of equality and accountability. When combined with a king facing serious health challenges shortly after taking the throne, it feeds a broader sense that the institution is struggling to keep pace with the world around it. Support has not vanished, but it has softened, becoming conditional rather than instinctive. Media narratives have played a major role in shaping this mood. Coverage of King Charles tends to swing between sympathetic and critical, sometimes within the same week. Documentaries about his early reign and his relationship with his sons have drawn both praise and backlash. Some viewers appreciate the deeper context and emotional honesty. Others accuse broadcasters, especially the BBC, of being too protective and too polished about the monarchy. At the same time, criticism of the king often spills over into criticism of the monarchy itself. Republican sentiment, once a fringe position, has become more visible and more confident. In the UK, campaigners argue that the country should move toward an elected head of state or reduce the monarchy to a purely ceremonial role. Economic pressures, rising living costs, and debates about public spending have influenced these arguments. To some, funding royal security and ceremonies feels harder to justify than ever. This shift is even more obvious in former Commonwealth realms. Barbados, has already removed the monarch as head of state. Other countries are openly debating similar moves. Besides, no matter how carefully King Charles manages his present, his past continues to sit beside him, shaping how the public judges every decision he makes. These legacy issues did not begin with his reign, but they follow it closely, resurfacing whenever the monarchy comes under pressure. For many people, their view of Charles is still filtered through moments and controversies that happened decades ago, long before he ever became king. At the top of these is the shadow of Princess Diana. Charles's marriage to Diana was a global emotional story. Their troubled relationship, played out in public through interviews, leaked recordings, and relentless media coverage, left deep marks. The affair with Camilla, now Queen, became a symbol of betrayal for many, especially after Diana's death in 1997. Even today, whenever Charles appears vulnerable, the story comes back. Documentaries are replayed. Old headlines are revived. For a large section of the public, Diana remains the emotional reference point, and Charles is still measured against a past he can never rewrite. Then there are the so-called Black Spider memos. Long before becoming king, Charles was known for writing letters to government ministers, often handwritten in thick, spidery ink, expressing strong views on issues ranging from architecture to alternative medicine. When some of these letters were eventually released after legal battles, they caused discomfort. Critics argued that Charles crossed a line by trying to influence elected officials. Supporters said he was simply passionate and engaged. But the damage remained. As king, he is expected to remain strictly neutral, yet these past actions make some question whether he can ever fully separate his personal convictions from his constitutional role. The issue of Commonwealth nationalism has added to this legacy. Under Queen Elizabeth II, the Commonwealth was often framed as a family of nations bound by history and mutual respect. Under Charles, that bond is weakened. Apart from Barbados, other countries, including Jamaica and Australia, have openly discussed leaving. While these movements are driven by local politics and historical grievances, they still land on Charles' desk. To critics, they suggest a monarchy losing relevance. To supporters, they are a natural evolution. Either way, they challenge the idea of a stable crown. Complicating matters further are scandals involving other members of the royal family. Prince Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein and the legal settlement that followed caused much reputational damage. Even though Andrew no longer carries out royal duties, the scandal continues to haunt the institution. It raises questions about judgment, accountability, and privilege. Add to this smaller controversies around royal charities and finances, and the image becomes harder to control. Charles has tried to enforce discipline and streamline the monarchy, but inherited problems do not disappear overnight. Taken together, these legacy issues mean that every conversation about Charles's health, leadership, or potential abdication is never just about the present moment. It is about decades of unresolved emotion, controversy, and change. The public is not only asking how Charles is doing now, but whether the monarchy he represents can move beyond the weight of its own history. And, as we'll reveal next, that question leads directly to a much bigger one: whether the British monarchy is facing a period of deep crisis or standing on the edge of a fundamental reinvention. Monarchy in crisis or reinvention? The big question around King Charles's reign is no longer only about his health or leadership. It is also about whether the monarchy itself can still fit into today's world. For the first time in many years, the future of the crown is being openly questioned, not just by experts, but by ordinary people. What happens next could shape not only Charles's legacy, but the monarchy's future for a long time. One major issue is the pressure on the institution itself. The monarchy sits in a modern democracy where people expect openness, fairness, and accountability. With questions on how an unelected head of state still makes sense in this kind of system, Ideas like reducing royal ceremonies, cutting back the number of working royals, or redefining the monarch's role are becoming more common. Charles has already spoken about wanting a smaller monarchy, but change is slow, and tradition is hard to move. The real question is whether small changes will be enough, or if bigger reforms will be needed later on. Money has also become a sensitive topic. With rising living costs and financial pressure on many families, public spending on the royal household is being watched more closely. Supporters say the monarchy brings in tourism and global influence, but critics focus on the cost of security, palaces, and daily operations. These debates now feel personal to many people who are struggling financially. For King Charles, showing restraint and responsibility is not just a choice, it is necessary if public support is to remain. Social change may be the biggest challenge of all. Younger generations are far more likely to question inherited power and privilege. Many see leadership by birth as old-fashioned and unfair. Social media has also changed everything, removing much of the mystery around the royal family and putting them under constant public judgment. Younger audiences are more diverse, less traditional, and less emotionally attached to the monarchy. To stay relevant, the royal family needs to show real purpose, not just tradition and ceremony. All of this leaves the monarchy at a turning point. It can hold tightly to old traditions and risk losing public support, or it can adapt and reshape its role for a new age. Whether King Charles can guide that change, or whether the crown will struggle under growing pressure, remains a crucial question for Britain's future. If King Charles were ever to step aside, the impact would go far beyond one man leaving the throne. It would trigger a series of legal, emotional, and cultural shifts that Britain has not faced in generations. Even as the palace denies any such plan, the idea itself has already reshaped how people think about the monarchy's future. A formal abdication would first require a clear constitutional plan. Parliament would need to pass specific legislation, just as it did in 1936, to make the decision lawful. This would not be a quick or simple process. Lawmakers would debate the timing, the wording, and the wider consequences. Beyond the UK, each Commonwealth realm would also need to respond through its own legal system, either accepting the change or using it as a moment to reconsider its ties to the crown. What looks like a personal decision would become a global legal event. The symbolic meaning would be just as powerful. Unlike Edward VIII, who abdicated for love and created chaos, Charles stepping down would be seen as a health and duty-driven decision. It would signal a clear break from the long-held belief that British monarchs reign for life, no matter the cost. For many, it would feel like the monarchy finally adapting to modern realities, where leadership has limits and human weakness is acknowledged. For others, it would feel like the end of a sacred tradition that once defined royal duty. There would also be an emotional response. Even critics of Charles would recognize the weight of the moment. Media coverage would likely be filled with reflection, reassessment, and quiet respect for a man who waited decades to rule, only to face some of the hardest years the monarchy has known. His reign would be judged through the lens of illness, family conflict, and global change, rather than length or grand achievements. Future generations may remember him less as a powerful king and more as a transitional figure who carried the crown through uncertain times. Whether abdication ever happens or not, the conversation alone has already changed the monarchy. It has forced Britain and the world to confront a difficult truth: that even the crown is no longer immune to age, pressure, and change, and that the future of the monarchy may depend on how honestly it faces those limits. That legacy would shape how King Charles is placed in history books and public memory. Some would credit him for opening the door to a more flexible, human monarchy that recognizes limits rather than denying them. Others would argue that his reign exposed weaknesses the institution had long tried to hide. Either way, an abdication would not erase his service. It would redefine it. It would mark the moment the monarchy chose adaptation over tradition and realism over ritual. And in doing so, it would place King Charles at the center of one of the most important turning points the British monarchy has faced in the modern age. What do you think? Will the crown survive these pressures, or is it on the brink of a new era entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.